get to come here, God, as your church, the people, as people who believe and people who are wondering and seeking, God, your church. Here united, here singing and praising you, God, testing your goodness. God, we're so grateful that you show up as a God who loves us in our mess, who has done the work already, and is now just seeking us to choose into that love, really. We're so grateful for that, Jesus. Lift up Phil, that his words are your words, that you will seek us out individually today with your spirit, that you will touch us, that we will do what we can to let those walls in our hearts, our stubbornness, that we will let that stuff just kind of crumble down and let you in, God, so you may show us how good you are and how you see us, Lord. Thank you, God, for being so good. And we say this in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Good to see you guys here this morning. Getting closer and closer to summer, right? Or it's feeling that way? With that said, I have one more announcement I'm throwing at you. I probably could do a few more, but we'll just stick with one. And that is summer staff that are joining us. So I want to introduce you guys. Over the summer, we bring out young adults who come in and invest in our youth group. And we try and create a really, really exciting ministry opportunity over the summer for our teenagers. And these are our 4 interns this summer. So you might recognize the first guy. That's Noah Monson. Yeah, right there. And he's jumping in over here at Stansbury. He's from the Salt Lake area. He's been playing with us at church, and we've been praying and praying for him to see if ministry would be a place. So he's going to check it out and be working with our teens here. The next is Conor Moore. He is from Fresno, California. He'll be serving in Grantsville. He'll actually be the latest one getting here in June. It says Conor Moore twice on there. That should say James Friesen. Oh, I made the slide. Yeah, that was my bad. That's James Friesen. He's going to be coming here working in Stansbury. He's from Olathe, Kansas. And last but not least is our very own Cicely Dust from Stansbury here. Yeah. And she'll be serving in Grantsville. So we'll have 2 interns in Stansbury and 2 in Grantsville. And if you have teenagers or connected to teenagers, interns bring a level of life to the youth ministry like nothing else. And it is going to be a fun summer for our teens. So, with that said, continuing in our series, for those who have not met me, my name is Phil. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor at LakeView and the campus pastor here at Stansbury Park. This series, Hitting the Mark, has been a lot of fun. And I want to start off with a question, one that I struggle with, one that I ask myself way too much, one that is probably on your minds, maybe not as much as you realize, but it's one that I ask more than I should. I ask it more than why am I here? I ask it more than where am I going? And it's simply this question. And the whole sermon today is based around this question: am I as good as they are? Am I as good as them? It's actually embarrassing that this is a question I ask. It floods my mind a lot. It actually burdens me more than I would like it. Am I as good as them? I hate it. It's a question that is all about comparison. And we all do this. We all compare ourselves to someone else, right? We're looking at them and we see their wealth, we see their talent, we see their fitness, or maybe sometimes their lack thereof, right? Sometimes we ask ourselves, am I as smart as them? Am I as successful as them? They're all different versions of the same question, and we just come down to this place where we go, am I as good as they are? And the first note for today, in light of this, comparing is a surefire way to feel like you're losing. That is a reality that we face, right? How often does this question pass through your mind? Like, the question shows up in the context of faith, right? When we compare religion, church, pastoring, it gets even uglier sometimes. I was thinking about this in faith. I grew up going to church, and I went to youth group, and one of the interesting things for me is that we would do these youth campouts, and if ever there was a Christian girl at the youth campout that I was at, I wanted to make sure I looked extra spiritual for her. Right? Hey, who wants to pray? Oh, I do. Is she looking? Right? It's as a young teenager, you're praying with one eye looking over, making sure she sees you doing it. Right? You're the first in there. But you want to be the one that everybody's looking at. And I was comparing myself. As long as I'm more spiritual than these other boys, she might take interest in me. So since I didn't marry a girl from my youth group, that didn't work. But the point is, I want us to break us free from the question, am I as good as they are? We want to break free from that. And we're going to see some really interesting examples today of other people who have struggled with this. In this series, Hitting the Mark, we have been looking at the Gospel of Mark, and specifically the stories of Peter, since John Mark got his account of the Gospel from Peter. And in today, it's super interesting, some of the things that we'll see. We're a little over halfway through the series, and sure, there's some pieces that we've missed, but we've really wanted to hit on the specifics that Peter shared of his own story. So today, we get to watch the disciples dealing with this question, am I as good as they are? And in fact, it's in this weird moment where Jesus shares with them, hey, I'm about to be crucified, and they're like, that's really sad, but we're great, right? We're great. It's sad that you're going to die, but we're great. That's kind of the context of the story today that happens. Makes me feel a little bit better about myself, right? If the disciples who are with Jesus in that moment are having a question about their own greatness, then as I am struggling with this as a person even today, their humanity and my humanity has a common connection, right? And that's our need for Jesus. So as we're digging into this, it's interesting. We see Peter and the disciples essentially get spinach in their teeth. They just look absolutely goofy. And I will tell you, one of the reasons that I think this is just kind of a significant thing about the Gospels is that it kind of gives a lot of validity to who Jesus was and is. Because if you were trying to write a story to gain power, to gain money, to gain standing, women, whatever it is, if you're Peter and you're John Mark, you don't share your hugely embarrassing failures, do you? And that's what they do. It's a validating piece of this gospel. Just a little side note. But with that, I want to jump right in here. Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 32. Leaving that region, is where we left off, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know where he was, or he didn't want to know that he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. And in this moment he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead. Remember I said this is, in this moment, in this conversation, this is what Jesus shares with his disciples. Okay, their response, they didn't understand what he was saying, however, they were afraid to ask him what he meant. Now, before we go into what they end up doing and where this goes, it's really important to note that Jesus knew what he was all about here. It wasn't this action that made him God. He was God and had a plan and knew what he was up to. He knew exactly that, and he shared that with them. He wasn't just a man. He knew his purpose. And the disciples didn't understand this. They didn't understand this piece. They didn't understand that he was fully God. They maybe had a concept of it, but it wasn't this act that made Jesus God. He was already God, and he knew it, and he shares it with them. I believe one of the reasons they were afraid to ask was not because they thought Jesus would be harsh in his answer to their question, but because they were afraid to hear his answer. Partially because for many of us, we don't maybe recognize this in today's world, but if your Lord or your rabbi got killed, the person that you were following, typically you got killed as well. We see that in Peter's fear when Jesus is heading to be crucified and he gets asked, he denies, because it was pretty typical that if your rabbi got killed as somebody who was causing disruption in the community, you would get killed as well. So there's a piece of fear in that, right? But there's also this part of asking the question might not give them the right answer. And the reality is when fear keeps you from asking tough questions, I want you to remember this as point number one. Your answers in life are only as good as your questions in life. Right? The quality of your questions in life will be the ceiling of the quality of your answers in life. You do not need to be afraid to ask questions. Ever. This carries over in every piece of life that we live, right? Our answers will only be as good as our questions. I know lots of people who don't want to ask a question because they're afraid of the answer. Because it might disrupt their worldview. It might disrupt their relationships. I've met many people in relationships with a person who is maybe not the healthiest person to be with, and you know something about it, and then you say, have you ever asked them about their history? And their response is, no, I don't want to know. It doesn't mean that their history defines them completely, but many people, like, if I know that, then I'll look at them differently. And unfortunately, we do that across the board when it comes to asking questions. And as believers, here's the coolest and freest thing about this, is there's no question that's out of bounds with Jesus. In religion, there is. But in a relationship, Jesus says, I'm an open book. It's a pretty fascinating thing. The point here is ask your questions. Now, in turn, as we continue in the scripture, Jesus asks his own question. He says, after they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, what were you discussing on the road? And here's the most interesting piece. Remember, he just shared the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed. That's what he shares. And what were you guys discussing? They didn't answer because they've been arguing about which of them was going to be the greatest. Like, can you imagine this moment with me? You're with Jesus. Maybe you don't fully have it figured out, but he shares something like that. Yeah. But which of us is top notch, Jesus? Right? It seems really ridiculous. When I think of this conversation, I look at my kids and they on a regular basis will say, hey, Dad, I'm better on the scooter than my sibling because, hey, Dad, which of us is the best at jumping on the trampoline? I'm like, how about you ask me which is the best at cleaning the house? That's the answer I want to give, right? But the crazy thing is we do this too. You think in this moment, who's going to argue about such a thing in Jesus' presence after he just predicted his death and resurrection? Like, who's going to argue that? But we do that ourselves. Am I as good as a Christian as they are? Right? If you grew up in religion, you surely ask this question, am I as good religiously as them? We've all been there. Then we answer the question, and it leads to pride because we think we are, or shame because we know that we're not. Right? Then to be better, we start competing spiritually, and unfortunately, competition is inevitable. Which leads me to point number 2. Christians competing makes Christianity embarrassing. Think about this just for a second. You're competing to be great in something that celebrates humility and service. It's weird. I'm going to outserve you. I'm going to be more humble than you. I am the most of all humblest. Like it just doesn't comprehend it. It's wrong. It's embarrassing. And competing to be seen as a great Christian is actually a huge sign of insecurity, and sometimes maybe even doubting or lack of understanding of what your relationship with Jesus is actually about. I would actually say for many of us that we're in this competing place in our faith, the question I'd ask is, do you actually know how Jesus sees you? Do you actually know that Jesus sees all your faults, all your failures, all your mistakes, and chose to die for you even still? Do you know that? Because if you actually know that, it changes this response. See, I would say when insecurity collides with religion, you get self-righteousness. And the next part is very important. Religion, as we define it at LakeView, is designed around self-righteousness. Religion, as we see it as LakeView, is designed around self-righteousness. And here's a note. The only way you know that you are righteous is by comparing and competing. Think about that for a second. How do you decide you're a good Christian? Like when we do this, it's so backwards. We take this moment and we go like, well, I'm not like that person. Or I'm reading my Bible this many times and praying this much. Well, who told you that was enough or not enough? Who decided for you that this was the measure of being good? Somewhere there's a standard you picked up along the way. A standard I picked up along the way. So let's ask the question, what makes a great Christian? When I asked myself this, the first person that came to mind was Billy Graham. Well, why? Well, because he stood on stage and preached to a lot of people, and he led a lot of people to Jesus. But the truth is, I don't know the ins and outs of his soul. Is he a great Christian? We go to Mother Teresa, right? She served all over and cared for these orphans, and she's just a wonderful servant. Well, it's great that she did that. I don't really want to do that. So her greatness is maybe a little bit too elevated for me, so I need to come down a few pegs. Where's like a semi sort of good pastor in the United States? I'm gonna compare. Thanks, Roman. He points at me. I'm gonna compare myself to that person and start doing that. Like, this is not a bash on Billy Graham or Mother Teresa, but the reality is for us, friends, is when we ask ourselves what makes a great Christian, there's a lot of comparing and competing. And what that does is it removes what Jesus has done for us and puts us back into the driver's seat of trying to be in control of how righteous we are. And when you think about the comparison thing, it's really flawed. Like, as the disciples are trying to ask who's the greatest, there's this piece you go like, what on earth is going on in their heads? Like, if it's me when I'm comparing, am I putting myself in the place of that person? And they don't belong in that place, right? Any way you go here, if you take a moment and think about this, when it comes to comparison, and you're looking at a great Christian, do you ask yourself this question: are they great because their sin seems like less icky than mine? Is that what I'm thinking? Like, what are we looking at them for? Do they appear to have it more together than I do? Do I ever really stop and think, is that what really makes them a great Christian? Do I know the ins and outs of their soul? I don't. Because if you look around, our news media loves to point out when a great pastor fails and falls. They love it. Oh, pastor caught an affair, pastor caught an adultery. Oh, pastor cheated on driver's test. Like, they love putting that stuff out there. Why? Because they see somebody who's been set as righteous fallen. And my encouragement to you guys, when you see Christians fall, whether they're great leaders or not, the one assurance that I can give you is, look, they're sinners. Just like me. The difference is my sin isn't caught on national TV. And that's just an interesting piece. And sometimes my sin isn't even noticed by anybody because I can hide it, but Jesus sees it all and it's all the same. So whose sin is more icky? You see the problem with the comparison thing? See the problem with asking, like, what makes a great Christian? Right? Jesus actually defines it, but before we get into that, unfortunately, this conundrum of what makes a great Christian gives us a kind of thinking that I think is rather silly, and we end up with a thing that I would call the Christianity religious spectrum. And what you have on one side is a bad Christian, on the other side is a great Christian, right? If you're a Christian and you swear a little, you move over to the bad side, right? Oh, but you gave at church, so you can move back over to the good side, right? Or you cuss a little and you listen to Cardi B. Well, that's going way over, right? We start having problems. Oh, but I went to youth camp and I served in children's ministry. It's kind of ridiculous. This is not how following Jesus works. It doesn't. And he does show us what greatness looks like according to him, right? This spectrum is so bizarre, but we do it. We put people all over the place on this. But Jesus says different. He says in Mark chapter 9, 35 through 37, he sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." That doesn't sound like the greatest in our society at all. Then this part's even more interesting if you understand the context of their culture when Jesus was around. It doesn't make quite as much sense with us. Then he put a little child among them, and taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me, not only me, but also my Father who sent me." Now, when he takes this child, it's significant because in our culture, we have a tendency to worship children a little bit more, and we kind of helicopter them a little bit. They can do no wrong to a degree. In their culture, children were like servants. Children were there to serve. They didn't have this place of royalty. You think be seen and not heard, and their culture was don't even be seen. So we have to make a real distinction. When Jesus is mentioning this, and he brings this child into their fold amongst them, he's actually demonstrating you need to be like the least of these, like the lowest of low. Children, servants, the same. This is who we need to care for. We need to care for this person. Now, I also want to point out that he says, be childlike, not childish. Right? Childlike is when my son Peter comes up to me and goes like this. Wants to be picked up. Wants to be connected. Childish is when he does something I don't appreciate around the house. Right? When he has that childish behavior. So being childlike is really important. Jesus sees greatness is in service. So when it comes to that, there's a couple of subpoints I want to run by you. So first point, subpoint number 1. According to Jesus, greatness is service. Right? The world says greatness is about how many people serve you. The world's philosophy is that if you're great, then people are serving you. That's what the world says. Jesus' approach is the exact opposite. Serving can be difficult. Now, some of you love to serve, and it comes naturally more for you than it does for others. And some of you it's more difficult. But I will tell you there's one type of service that is nearly impossible for all of us to do. There's one type of service, one type of person that is one of the hardest to love and care for. And that's subpoint number 2. You ready for this? It's nearly impossible to serve someone you think you are better than. And that one goes deep if you open that sucker up. He's like, I don't think that way. But you do at some point. Every one of us does. We can serve all kinds of people. But the person we're better than, that one's the hardest. I find it so fascinating that Jesus placed a child among them. The word child and servant in the original language of Aramaic are very similar. And Jesus is giving them a living illustration of greatness and humility. Serve those you think should serve you. Serve those you think who should serve you. Jesus was making a point that you are not better than a child. Serve the least of these. Then he connects our serving and welcoming of the least of the people welcoming to him. Now that they say somehow, not that they say become Jesus, but we honor him when we honor them. We don't become him, but we honor him when we honor them. It's such an interesting idea, and it's nearly impossible to serve someone you think you are better than. And if you walk away from today with that, there's somebody in your life where you're just like, yeah, that would be tough. You want to engage with Jesus, that's a first step. Starting to care for someone like that. Taking up your cross. Subpoint number 3 here. We honor and serve him when we honor and serve them. Just when you think, surely the disciples will get it, they're arguing about being the greatest, the conversation takes an interesting turn and they go right back to competing. Which one of us is the greatest, Lord? We know you said you're going to die, but which one of us is the greatest? And then Jesus is like, hold on, we need to serve. Oh, okay, we get it. However, we have this to say. Teacher, we saw someone using your name to cast out demons, but we told him to stop because he wasn't in our group. Not one of us. And Jesus is like, don't stop him. No one who performs a miracle in my name will soon be able to speak evil of me. And get this, anyone who is not against us is for us. Let's just pause for a second. It is so easy as people in the comparing world, in the world of comparison, to look at other people and decide that they don't know who Jesus is, nor does Jesus love them. Like, we can do that. Not we can do that good. We can do that bad. Like, that's not a good thing. But we do that. We look across the aisle at people who are not like us, whether it's worldview, whether it's faith practice, and we just go like, not good enough. We don't know, let me just be honest with you, we don't know what Jesus is doing in their life. We have no idea what he has done and stepped in and how he has touched their heart and soul. They might go to a different church, they might believe in a different faith. Jesus is the only way, but we don't know that Jesus isn't reaching in and touching their hearts. And they might do things a little bit backwards. There was a series we did back in January that was called Does Not Compute, and there's a guy named Cornelius who was doing all these practices of the faith, praising God, but had no idea who Jesus is, and yet Jesus says to him, your offerings and prayers have been accepted. It's like outside the box. That still happens today. I guess this is a call for me, for myself, and to share with you. Anyone who's not against us is for us, is we really don't know who Jesus is working on right now. By all appearances, we could say he's working on the disciples, but they're with him and arguing about who's going to be the greatest. It seems like they've kind of missed the mark. This series is about hitting the mark. And then you have people who would appear to be non-believers, and yet Jesus is grabbing a hold of them, though they don't know exactly who he is in that moment. He is working on them. It's just a call for us to put down the stones, right? Let Jesus do the heavy lifting. Let us represent him. If anyone gives you even a cup of water because you belong to the Messiah, I tell you the truth, that person will surely be rewarded. So this isn't a competition, Jesus says. You aren't competing. By the way, let people give you a cold cup of water too. Let them serve you. Point number 3, not only are we to serve, we are to allow others to serve us. At Lakeview, I tell people, do not rob people of the blessing of serving you. When you think of us like, no, I can't accept that, well, you just stole from them their opportunity to bless you, which, you know what, is a blessing to them, just like you serving is a blessing to you. Don't steal that from people. If they want to bless you, let them. And if you're like me, you're awkward when they do it, but that's okay. Just say thank you. You know, that's kind of where we're going with this. Don't rob them the opportunity to grow in serving. People are comfortable giving to others, but quite often